Thank you. And a very warm welcome to this, the final in our series of policy roundtables looking at women's entrepreneurship globally. My name's Dinah Bennett, and I am the co-lead for enterprise development at the Women's Economic Imperative, an NGO that operates internationally supporting women's economic empowerment. And we're delighted to be working in partnership with the Global Women's Entrepreneurship Policy Network on this series, which have really brought to life a whole range of different issues over the last few months. So I'm delighted to welcome my colleague, Professor Colette Henry, who pioneered the GWEP, to introduce you to today's session. Over to you, Colette.
Thanks, Dinah, and welcome everyone to this, the fourth, and as Dinah said, the final session. I'm Colette Henry, and I'm based at Dundalk Institute of Technology and also Griffith University, Australia. I have the pleasure of chairing the Global WEP project, which is the Global Women's Entrepreneurship Policy Research Network. Currently, we're a group of 36 countries where the researchers are all dedicated to focusing on women's entrepreneurship policy and trying to ensure there's a more balanced entrepreneurial ecosystem for aspiring and existing women entrepreneurs. Now, our work so far has resulted in several publications, several webinars, a number of reports and workshops. We have particularly co-edited the OECD report, Entrepreneurship Policies Through a Gender Lens, that was released in 2021 by the group. And if you haven't had a chance to look at that, I'd encourage you to do so. We've also had a number of books. We've had our second book just published, and we have a special issue coming up in the International Journal of Entrepreneurial Behaviour and Research, and we welcome contributions to that up until the end of April. So I'd like just to finish off by thanking Dr. Dina Naziku, who's part of our executive team, and she's very kindly put together this fabulous panel for us today. And chairing the panel is Dr. Baldina Owala from Portsmouth University. And Baldina is a very active member of Global WEP. She's part of the UK team, and she's already done huge work for us because she led the editing of the first Global WEP book, along with Tim Vorley and Helen Lawton-Smith. So, Baldina, we're delighted that you've given us the time to chair today's session, and I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Colette, and thank you, Dinah, as well, for allowing us to have this session. As Colette has mentioned, my name is Baldina Owala, and I'll be moderating today's session that will look at Sub-Saharan African women entrepreneurs thriving in the Covid-19 pandemic. So just as a brief introduction to the session, we know that the COVID-19 pandemic was a shock to societies and economies globally, and highlighted society's dependencies on women, both at home and at work, while at the same time revealing the systemic gender disparities that occur in all sectors of the economy. So the impact of the pandemic was even more pronounced in Africa due to many governments' inability to provide the safety nets that would enable the entrepreneurs within the private sector to mitigate the impact of the shock. And therefore, responding to the crisis was not only about addressing these long-standing inequalities, but also creating a resilient environment for everyone, with women at the center. So today's session will focus on the findings of a research study that explored the experiences of women entrepreneuring in a crisis. And it was a qualitative research that involved carrying out interviews and focus groups with women based in Ethiopia, Ghana, Malawi, Nigeria, Tanzania, South Africa, and Zambia. And the aim of the study was mainly to tell the stories of women that reflects a coherent sense of self-worth, allowing them to adapt to the disruptions caused by the pandemic through the strategic use of agency. And today's panel will be able to share with us the insights from the discussions of these women's experiences in starting, running, and growing their businesses during the pandemic. So we have a great panel of speakers today who are all involved in the study, and I'll just briefly introduce them before we begin. We have Dr. Dina Nziku, who's a senior lecturer and director of research and publication at the Center of African Research on Enterprise and Economic Development at the School of Business and Creative Industry at the University of West of Scotland. And her interests are in women's entrepreneurship and government policies for promoting entrepreneurship in developing countries. The second panel member is Dr. Atsede Tesfaye Hailemariam, who is an assistant professor at the School of Commerce at Addis Ababa University in Ethiopia. And her research has focused on women entrepreneurs' motivations, success, and growth, as well as understanding the role of social cultural context within which women's businesses operate. And our third panel member is Dr. Cynthia Forson, who is an associate professor and deputy provost at the Lancaster University in Ghana. Her research interests cover issues of equality, diversity, and inclusion in the labor market and organizations, particularly looking at gender, ethnicity, class, and migrant status, as well as the intersectional influences these have on women's lives and careers. Unfortunately, one of the panel members, Dr. Bridget Irene, will not be able to join us today, but the other panel members will be able to cover the work that was done in the 7 countries. So to begin our discussion, we'll start focus on understanding what impact the COVID-19 pandemic had on female entrepreneurs and how they responded. And I'll pass over to Dr. Dina Nziku to give us her findings in the Malawi, Tanzania, and Zambia. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Biradina, and thank you for your very nice and generous introduction. To kickstart this conversation, because as you have heard that we did this research on 7 different countries in Sub-Saharan Africa. So I will try to base my conversation on 3 countries, and that will be on the findings that we had from Malawi, Tanzania, and Zambia. And my colleague, sister Cynthia, will speak about findings that we had from Ghana, Nigeria, and South Africa. And Atsede will talk about Ethiopia. And we have a very good reason as well on how did we group these countries based on to the findings that we had. And also it is based on to a little bit of closeness and similarities on how women went on thriving during the COVID-19 pandemic on these 7 different countries. So talking of Malawi, Tanzania, and Zambia, first of all, how did this woman or how did the COVID-19 impacted them? We, like any other countries at that time, there was a lot of confusions. So this confusion went on causing some confusions in terms of regulatory and operational challenges. Now, what kind of challenges did they face? As I said that, well, the first thing, it was confusion and shock to all women who were doing business. Now, the confusion where it was like, because it was a new virus and nobody knew about the virus and how serious it was, there was a little bit of a mixed message. So mixed messages. So if we look onto these 3 countries, Tanzania, Malawi, and Zambia, 3 countries, two countries, Malawi and Zambia, for them, they didn't go through that government lockdown, like completely lockdown. So they had a little bit of a partial lockdown. So it means that their lockdown, it wasn't the same as the lockdown that we experienced here in Europe and some other different countries. While the country like Tanzania, for them, it was business as usual. So they didn't lock down the country at all, and they continued as normal. And that was also because of the strategies of the leadership within the country. So with that, I'll talk first of what happened in the case of Tanzania. So when that happened, because the government decided that, well, business as normal and people should keep on living about, but being cautiously of the illness. So they continued the business, but because they are not the landlocked country, and also business women, the nature of the business that they were doing, they were relying on either importations or exportations. So even if the country had that business as normal policy or strategy in place, there was a lot of delays in products and commodities arriving at the ports. And because most of the products that women are relying on, or they have been selling, based on to the number of women that we had in the conversation, they were importing some products from China. They were importing some products from different other countries. So if there was a completely lockdown in China, and in Tanzania, they didn't lock down, still there was some delays, or so they didn't manage to get even some of the product at all. And not only that, the reason to why also they didn't lock down, it's because the country thought that because there are some other countries that are landlocked, the countries like Zambia, Malawi, Uganda, Rwanda, and Bujumbura. These are countries that are relying on their importation and exportations. It's relied on to Tanzania, because Tanzania is the one that is at that have got a big port there. So Tanzania thought that not locking the country, it will help even these other landlocked countries that are relying on Tanzania to pass their goods. And mainly it was thought that, well, in order for them to be able to pass their medical supplies and PPEs. Of course, to a certain extent, it was successful, but not that much. Now, talking on women, for them, some of them, they struggled with their business because they wanted to continue because the country didn't lock down, but it was difficult for them to continue because they were not getting their supplies or their business products. And not only that, but also some other women, they were facing some financial challenges. So it means that even if the business were continuing and they were able to sell the products that they already had in their stores, still it was a challenge because other people individually, they were scared of the illnesses, so they didn't continue with that, with like buying, and also they had that uncertainty that, well, they were not spending money for buying each and everything. They were trying to make sure that, well, they're taking care of the little money that they have, just in case if somebody got sick, then money could be spent to treat their family members and other things. And also, there was also a scarcity of commodities in the market. As I said that, well, because even if there were some containers that were arriving at the ports, there were some delays in clearing and forwarding, because when other countries like Zambia and Malawi, they locked the countries, meaning that at the ports in Dar es Salaam, there were a lot of goods that were not cleared, and there were not a lot of goods that were not coming out to go to these other countries that they have decided to lock down. So even if Tanzania decided not to lock, still it was a problem for them because a lot of goods were just like accumulated at the ports. And how did they manage now to respond onto that? So as I said that, well, because for Malawi and Zambia, they locked down. So for them, they were only doing things that they can manage to do for survival. And not only the things that they can manage to do for survival, some businesses, they decided to close. So when they were trying to close, employees were struggling because there was no any job retention scheme that were offered by the government. Like here in Europe, there was that furlough scheme where employees could receive a little bit of money from the government to keep on surviving while they're staying at home. Now, in these Sub-Saharan African countries that we research, like Tanzania, Zambia, and Malawi, we found that a lot of women, they felt that, well, they couldn't stop doing whatever they were doing. They knew that they had to keep on continuing, even if they were earning little. For those women who were employing, they came to the point where they decided that, okay, we have to send back these employees, that we have to stop them from coming to work because we don't have much income to be able to afford to pay them some salaries. However, the nature, the culture, and the way how Africans are, this is something that the study have realized that many women that we were speaking with them during the discussions, they told us that, well, they came to the point where they woke up in the morning and they decide to call all their employees and to tell them that, okay, guys, we're not making money, so you should go home. We cannot pay you salary and we're not making money at all. And those employees, they felt that going home, they will be staying at home. They're not going to be making money. So the best thing, they went on begging to their employees that, well, can we just keep on coming and working, even if we're not getting, even if you can't afford to pay us, but allow us to keep on working, because eventually at any time when you will be able to earn, then you will pay us slowly according to how you can afford. So that was something also which in economy, there is a difference when a person is sitting down and a person is working, even if they're not getting paid, but they are working, meaning that they're still developing with the economic activities. So some of them, they decided that, well, because these women, they need something to feed their families. That's when we went on realizing that, well, most of women, they felt sorry as well, because they knew that, okay, if these people are willing to work for free and get paid as and whenever I will be able to afford to get some money, they decided to allow them. But when they decided to allow them, these women entrepreneurs in 3 different countries that I'm talking about, Malawi, Tanzania, and Zambia, most of them who allowed their employees to keep on working, even without being paid, at the end, they found themselves in a position of not only providing for their own family as women entrepreneur, but they ended up on supporting the families of their employees. Because remember, these are employees who have just decided to volunteer to keep coming to work during that time rather than staying at home. So they're working and they're not paid, they're not getting paid. So women entrepreneurs, they decided, okay, because we don't pay them, let us try to do something that will be helping their families. So it was either helping them with a little bit amount of food, maybe to help with the family to be able to eat. If any employee had a child who was sick, their employer were trying also to help even with treating their employees' children, and even their employees extended were somehow managed to get supported by these entrepreneurs. So we will see that, well, generally, I don't want to just talk much, because you will want also to hear some other examples of what happened into these other countries, is that the way how they did in order to cope with this, knowing that their government were not helping them, or there was no any financial support from the government, it was for them to live as relatives and to keep on helping not only their families, but also their employees, knowing that they were all in it together. So they went on supporting each other's, at the same time, keep on doing the business, the business that were able to be done. But there are some other business, they had to just change even whatever they were selling to start selling things that were in high demand. So I would like to leave for my colleague Cynthia to talk about what happened with women in Ghana and Nigeria and South Africa. Thank you.
Thank you, Dinah. Welcome, Cynthia.
Thank you. I guess what I would say is that the stories in South Africa, in Nigeria, and in Ghana, across the board were quite similar. But as Dina has said, there were quite a number of differences, from what happened in Tanzania, Zambia, and Malawi, which were, I suppose, contextually contingent. So the context really determined everything. So if you look at South Africa, for example, compared to Ghana and Nigeria, South Africa has a more temperate weather. And so for some reason, and the world still doesn't know why, in tropical African countries, COVID did not take as strong a hold as it did in some temperate countries like South Africa. So South Africa experienced COVID in harsher terms than in most of the rest of tropical Africa. They went into a partial lockdown, as did Ghana and Nigeria. In South Africa, for example, there was a 90% reduction in most activities, a 70% reduction in shopping. There was an 85% reduction in on-site workforce, in terms of the workforce being at their workplaces, which means that there was a real slowdown of activity. There was partial lockdown in Nigeria and Ghana as well, but Ghana, for example, tended to focus on the capital cities. And so it was very strict, very stringent in Kumasi and Accra, but the rest of the country, although officially were in lockdown, practically got on with their lives as usual. So in Ghana, for example, there was a partial lockdown, but work continued in sectors like the production, distribution, and marketing of food, beverages, pharmaceuticals, medicine, paper and plastic, and transport. You can see how, for example, the marketing of food would be a sector where women would be predominant. So women, in some respects, some of women's work continued. In other respects, they were very restricted, and a lot of the sectors were male-dominated sectors like construction, like transport, pharmaceuticals, medicine, etc. So the pandemic had a devastating effect on women in particular because personal services suffered greatly. Hairdressing, dressmaking, nail salons, etc., etc. But food in particular did quite well. Now, this meant, of course, that women in the different countries experienced this quite differently. They had difficulties in accessing available support. So, for example, Tanzania, which Dina has talked about, has an overarching female entrepreneurship policy. Ghana doesn't. So support was sporadic, it was fragmented. South Africa, Nigeria, and Ghana had difficulties, women there had difficulties accessing any support that was available, primarily due to corruption, one, and two, a lack of information. They actually didn't know where to go to get the support that was required, although they had heard there was support available. The other thing about Ghana and Nigeria was that a lot of the help went to larger businesses because government contracts were going into places like the production of PPE, but the government was looking for larger businesses to provide PPE. So we spoke to a hairdresser, for example, who had shifted her production from dressmaking to the production of masks. But she couldn't get government contracts because the government contracts were going to larger companies that could provide, for example, produce 2,000 masks a day. SMEs during this time were not allowed to subcontract. So an SME couldn't take the business and then subcontract it to, let's say, 3 or 4 other businesses in order to survive. So they lost out on those sorts of contracts. The other thing that this meant was that help, therefore, came from personal contacts, families, friends, etc. For Nigeria in particular, what we found was that a lot of their help came from formal personal networks, like churches. Churches came together to provide support for the women. There were, of course, financial challenges in all 3 countries around sales uncertainty, a lack of revenue, etc. And all women across the board were threatened by business closure, and the anxiety and the fear that this generated, I'll come to it in a second. Of course, there were supply chain difficulties as well. In Ghana, Ghana and Nigeria, the port was open, but the land borders were closed. Now, this meant that for a lot of female businesses, which are in the informal sector and dependent on informal trade across the borders, this became a supply chain nightmare for them because they couldn't get their goods and their services across the land borders. And the land borders remained closed for almost a year, even though the ports were open. So the more formal your business was, the more likely you were to get your supply, even if it had slowed down. But informal businesses where women are predominantly situated, there were difficulties. There were also huge difficulties around the skills required to move across from the existing marketing and delivery channels to digital channels, for example. Only 25% of the women that we spoke to felt that they had the digital skills required to be able to move their businesses from, for example, face-to-face, in-person to the digital world. And that was quite a problem for Ghana and for Nigeria, and also for some of the South African women. And I think one of the important things that we need to talk about here is the cultural challenges that exacerbated these women's experiences across all the countries that we are talking about. So one, obviously, the informality of women's businesses in these parts of the world, the high levels of female-led households, for example, in South Africa in particular, and lots of South African women talked about that, making the success or otherwise of these women's businesses absolutely crucial to family survival. Of course, domestic responsibilities, though, as women in the African setting, there were additional responsibilities for ensuring, for example, that the immediate and extended family members and employees and their families were safe from COVID, but also surviving the COVID pandemic in terms of financial survival. So these women kept doling out money that they didn't have to employees and their families in order for them to be able to survive. And then one of the things that I've looked at in previous work are cultural norms that delegitimize women entrepreneurs. Now, this kind of excludes them from business networks and from formal business networks that gives them the information they need to navigate business crisis. Because they were outside of these networks, it became very difficult for them to get access to information. So a lot of the women we talked to said, oh, we hear there's help available. We hear this institution. We hear the Bank of Nigeria is giving some money, but we don't know how to access. Well, I've applied, I haven't heard anything back, and I don't know where to go to ensure that I get the money. And then finally, what I'd like to talk about, which the South African women in particular raised, were mental health challenges. And they talked about the severity of the pandemic, one, in terms of their own safety and safety for their families, but also the business crisis that they were going through meant that they had anxiety, fear, etc. In African society, to a large extent, mental health is a cultural taboo. So nobody talks about it, nobody goes for help. And these women felt quite isolated in their environments and not being able to access any help that was available if it was available. I will leave it there for now so that Chede can continue, and then we can come back to how these women responded. Is that okay, Beldina?
Yes, that's fine. I'll just invite Atsede to give us the experience of women in Ethiopia. Thank you.
Thank you, Beldina. Hi, everyone. I'm going to focus or give my speech on impact of COVID on female entrepreneurs in Ethiopia. So the first thing just I want to mention is what was action taken when we have the first outbreak on March 13. By the way, the first outbreak in Ethiopia was 3 months later than China, 1 month later in Italy, but all of us were shocked. Even one of our respondents said that it was shocking for us, and we have heard a lot, everything, everybody lost hope. Then we are just becoming familiar with it after a certain time. So this has made a shock to businesses and all people. As a result of this, demand for their product and service has declined. There was also a closure of businesses. By the way, when we talk about lockdown, in Ethiopia, there was only a partial lockdown. Schools, entertainment, bars, and sport activity were fully closed, but all economic activities continued, restricting the number of customers in hotels and restaurants, could serve, and also for transport to operate at a half capacity. There was also a condition where landlords were required to waive or to give a holiday for rent, and government has also given a 50% reduction of housing rent. So these were there, a kind of also a tax relief was there. But as I mentioned, schools were closed. But due to this, for instance, one of our respondents, they have mentioned most of the things that were similar to Ethiopia, but I will mention only those parts that was not mentioned by two of my colleagues. One of our participants was a bookstore. She owns a bookstore. So what she said is that because that I cannot, university students and schools, universities as a whole are our customers, so they are not coming. Due to transportation problem, employees are not also coming to work on time. So we were forced to close the business for about 2 months, as she said. Even though it was allowed, she was supposed to close because of this reason. And also, they were required to pay salary, not to terminate full employment, permanent employees. So they were, even though they don't have the income, they were forced to give salary of employees, permanent employees. So due to this and due to the other cases of transportation problem, there were, when they are going to government offices, they're not getting the service that they wanted. For instance, one of the respondents says that you don't get response from the government office. Based on that, our company has faced some limitation and we are forced to postpone our plans. So she has postponed an expansion project that she has already started. So mainly, other than that, they have spoke about lockdown of borders, import, and so on. These are the different cases that we have in Ethiopia. Of course, the other thing is that taking care of husband, children, extended family. By the way, in Ethiopia, family is not only nuclear. We have extended family. Once you are married, you're going to take care of not only your spouse's family also. And it's possible that they can live also with you. So because of this reason, it has taken them their time not to do some of the businesses that they were required. And one of the consultancy service that we interviewed, it is a consultancy service. It has to be face-to-face, but due to this social distancing and wearing a mask, it is very difficult to advise people to give a service face-to-face. So what she did was either to have a phone call or to do with WhatsApp. So these are some of the things that is unique from what my friends mentioned, my colleagues mentioned. But the other thing is that when we come to the support, of course, you know that it is African culture is a collective culture. If somebody is going to be in a problem, everybody will try to participate to help that person. So money that they got from family, friends, and also from institutions, not government, like we have what we call Women Entrepreneur Development Project, which is backed by World Bank. That institution used to give credit to their members. Not only credit, they were also trying to give advice by having a specialized app on their phone. So that help was there, besides, of course, a few exemption of taxes for only even some of them said that we have heard, but we were not exempted. I don't know for whom they have exempted. Some of them are exempted, but our participant did not mention that they are provided with this exemption of taxes. So these are just the things that is unique from what my colleagues mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you, Atsede. I think just hearing from the different countries, there are some similarities that were experienced, but also you find that there's a difference in the type of government support that was available. And so in this second round, I'd just like the panel members to just briefly reflect on how the support can be more effective to support women who are recovering, especially in a crisis. So I'll ask that we start with Dina again.
Okay, thank you so much, Beradina. Yeah, onto this, after studying and talking to these women from 7 different countries, and trying to understand what they went through and maybe what would have worked much more better, and maybe what does different countries or different government should have done, and also the way forward if there is any other pandemic, what could be good that would have helped these women. So before I can just start myself, I would like first, because we have just looked into the issues of government policies and regulations. So I would want to, first of all, Cynthia, if you can talk to our audience about the policies on entrepreneurial ecosystem, and then at Sede we'll talk on the policies that are within education, and then I'll come and I'll finish about the training.
Okay.
Sorry, I just realized I was muted. So I think it is quite clear from both this research and previous research that all 4 of us, either individually, together, or with other people, have done on the African continent looking at entrepreneurial women, is that, I mean, Africa is the only continent on which there are more women entrepreneurs than men. And yet it is also the continent on which, and when I talk about Africa, I'm talking about Sub-Saharan Africa. It is also the continent on which we have the weakest entrepreneurial ecosystems. And the African Union has made it part of its agenda to support and strengthen female entrepreneurship on the continent. However, this can only start, to be honest, with individual countries developing national frameworks for entrepreneurship, strong frameworks that don't simply sort of bolt women on as an accessory, but frameworks that actually look at female entrepreneurship seriously and develop these frameworks. And these frameworks need to be gender impact assessed to ensure that although they are national frameworks, I mean, we all know that it's very difficult to get governments to look at women, mainstream women into entrepreneurial frameworks. But at the very least, for existing frameworks like those in Tanzania, for example, they need to be gender impact assessed to ensure that these frameworks have not been developed in ways in which they lead to inequality, particularly when it comes to women. But for countries like Ghana and for Nigeria, where there is no actual set framework, we need to develop frameworks that strengthen the entrepreneurial ecosystem. The other way that this can be done, and this is from previous experience that I have done, looking at what the optimum entrepreneurial ecosystem might be for African countries, is government support for deliberate collaboration and networks of support between women business owners, women policyholders, and policymakers, and women academics. And one of the ways in which this helps is to facilitate knowledge exchange and innovation within the female entrepreneurial ecosystem, because then knowledge gets exchanged between the academics who are producing the knowledge, the policyholders who have problems to solve, and the businesswomen who are the problem solvers. And this triangular relationship seems to work quite effectively in creating a knowledge exchange network, so to speak, that allows women from the different parts of this ecosystem to work together to solve problems. I'll pass over to Atsede to look at support for finance.
Just to mention that the ecosystem, when it comes to the ecosystem, institutions outside the governments that we are seeing nowadays in our country, more support come from institutions outside the government. As I mentioned, like World Women Entrepreneurship Development Project and other projects. So these projects need to have finance because they are doing it through finance institution, and they are doing it through saving and credits. So because of this COVID problem, these institutions have a lack of cash solvency. So because there was no saving during that time, people are not paying back their loan were just suspended for a period of time. So the major thing that the government should do is that looking for national banks to give money for these institutions so that they can lend it to women entrepreneurs. And the important thing of all the things is that the association, Women Entrepreneur Association, as Cynthia mentioned, it is women that are really devoted to work for the women than the men. So if these associations, there are going to be creation of this association. For instance, we don't have like angel capital in our country. Starters, they get it from home and so on. If we can have same type of things for the women to start and also to expand their business, it is a good idea that government should think of in their policy. When it comes to training, of course, trainings should be given, not focusing only on business skills. It has to be also like crisis management, like stress management, where employers are facing. Nowadays, the training that we see is mainly on business skills and on finance. But if we have like stress management, how to deal with crisis management, this type of things should be also included in the training. So as I said, facilitating informal business networking, especially women networking, or it can be also with men as long as they are looking for just supporting the women entrepreneurs to survive and expand in the market. So these are the other things that I have. Of course, business support channels like churches, especially when we come to our country, religion is very serious and people take it seriously. So when there is going to be any problem that's going to occur, they are therefore to help and give their hands or support. So I just try to mention that it's very important that we focus on this type of networking and Saving and Credit Association, MFI, the National Bank, to just give a loan to this institution so that they will be able to give a loan to the women entrepreneurs. That's what I just want to mention.
Okay, thank you so much, Atsede. And I would like also to finish this the issue of entrepreneurial ecosystem in Africa on women entrepreneurs. I will talk more about training and mentoring. So based on our study and a lot of recommendations that we would like to provide after having done this empirical study. First of all, when it comes to training and mentoring in Africa, we think that there is a gap, and there is a lot of work that the government still needs to do in facilitation of informal business networks. Because we have seen that, well, women are learning, not only women, but any entrepreneur, they are able to learn from each other when there is a facilitation of informal networks. Now, through these informal networks, they are able to learn not only formal knowledges, but they can learn even informal knowledges on how to go about with their business and how to cope. And that is also part, together with trying to look on to the specific aspects of business management, for instance, crisis management. So we have seen that, well, in Africa, the issue of coronavirus, COVID-19, it wasn't the only crisis that the African countries have faced. We've seen that, well, in the past, there have been some other health disasters that have happened, like if you look on the issue of Ebola in West Africa. But it doesn't mean that, well, when Ebola happened, all business, they died. So there are a lot of business that survived. So if governments or different government will try to facilitate this formal and informal networking, meaning that people or entrepreneurs will be able to learn from different people's based on to their experience of how did they manage to survive the past pandemics. And also, we also just would like to recommend the issue of embedding different levels of entrepreneurial trainings. Now, when we talk of different levels of entrepreneurial trainings, entrepreneurs needs to be trained not only in order to be able to start, but also they need to be trained in order to develop and grow their business. So training should be continuously, but that also, it needs a little bit of support from government. And with those trainings, again, we're coming back, both formal and informal trainings should be provided. And as you have heard also from the examples that we have given from the 7 different countries, we've seen the impact or the good role, the good work that was done by religious institutions. So these are non-government organizations, but on the conversation during the time when we were talking with these women entrepreneurs from 7 different countries, we have seen that almost in every different country out of these 7 countries, women were mentioning the good things that they managed to just not get from religious institutions. So if religious institutions can contribute informally towards helping women entrepreneurs or towards helping businesses, so we think that also governments needs to do something in order to facilitate these religious institutions, or if it is not the facilitations of religious institutions, it should be also even using religious institutions towards achieving some of their objectives and goals, because people knows that, well, they can trust the religious institutions in different things. They can go and gather easily in religious activities. So government also can look on to towards trying to use these religious institutions as well to make sure that they can reach up to these women entrepreneurs or any of the businesses. So there are other things that we don't want to take much of the time, but we would like also to hear from you people who have been listening to us. If you have any questions, yeah, I'll take it back to Beladina. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you once again for that interesting discussion. I think we have, I'll just call upon Cynthia for a quick.
Okay, sorry, I'm just conscious of the fact that this talk was titled Women Entrepreneurs Thriving. And I think we have talked a lot about the problems that they had, but we haven't actually engaged with what we meant by them thriving. And I think what I think we need to, very quickly, I need to say, is the ways in which these women were absolutely positive about the pandemic. They told us their problems because we asked them about their problems, but there was a general positive attitude from these women. Secondly, they trained each other. So a lot of the women in there talked about the fact that they had tried to train other women in terms of how to survive through the pandemic. There was an excitement about the opportunities that they had discovered in COVID-19, for example. So for Nigeria, where the land borders were closed, there was one woman who was producing bags, and she decided that she was going to use local raw materials to do her bags. And that had created a completely different marketplace for her. There was a high dependence, as we've said, on spiritual support, however defined, looking inwards, looking to the church, looking to God, etc., etc. And there was a very can-do attitude about these women that we were talking to. They weren't, kind of woe is me crowd. In terms of all the focus groups that we did, many women had new delivery channels, new marketing channels, in spite of their lack of digital skills, for example. They had asked their children, their teenagers, to set up WhatsApp groups and Instagram accounts and so on and so forth for them. Some of them had enhanced their customer support. So a woman who, for example, sold face creams couldn't get to her clients. So she decided to have a telephone service where she was educating them about how to keep your skin healthy without using the face creams, for example. There were new business startups which are health related, because at that point, everybody's mind was on health. And so a woman who was an interior designer decided to begin to educate her customers about the use of citronella candles to ward off mosquitoes and therefore malaria. I mean, the pandemic wasn't about malaria, but people were sitting in their gardens at the time and were thinking about mosquitoes biting them. And so that led to a different way of her getting business. And of course, as I've said, the supply chain lines, new supply chain lines in terms of using local producers for their raw materials. So I just wanted to get that across, because we've talked a lot about the problems and the lack of policy and so on and so forth. But these women were upbeat, they were doing new things, and they were discovering new things as a result of this pandemic. And I think it was important for me to say that.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. Yeah, and just because of, in the interest of time, I'll just hand over to Colette for some final reflections. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Baldina. And thanks to the panel. That was such a great discussion. And as usual, we never have enough time to cover all the issues. But we heard a lot of things here today about how women entrepreneurs were impacted in Sub-Saharan Africa during the Covid-19 pandemic. Lots of differences in terms of the impact of the crisis, but also lots of similarities. We heard about confusion and shock. I mean, I think that occurred in every nation. But we also heard that in some places there were partial lockdowns or no lockdowns at all. We heard that some of the land borders were closed in some regions, whilst the ports stayed open. So there were lots of impacts in terms of being able to get goods into the different countries. And we found, what we heard today from the panel is that these women basically went into survival mode, and many of them survived with their businesses in spite of what was happening with the pandemic. In many places, there was no furlough scheme, no support, or very little support. And I think what was really interesting to hear was that a lot of women decided that they would just keep going with their businesses anyway, and employees decided they would keep coming into work, whether they were paid or not. This great collective sense of helping each other, I think, is what has really come out of this discussion. And I think what we heard in terms of how government can do better, we were told that really different individual countries need to establish their own very strong entrepreneurial frameworks, and these need to be gender balanced. So, of course, they have to be assessed for their gender impact. More work needs to be done to support the networking between women entrepreneurs, academics, and policymakers, because that is the only way that we're going to learn and improve systems. We heard what I thought was really interesting, that there was a lot of support coming from outside of government, so informal networks, religious organizations, and the critical role that churches were playing during this crisis. And this notion of women helping each other, learning from each other, training each other, and just generally getting through the crisis together. So I think this was a really fascinating discussion. I just want to thank the individual panel members. As I said, Dina for putting this brilliant panel together, Baldina for chairing it so brilliantly, and Etseri and Cynthia for all your input. And can I thank Dinah and Margot from the Way Forward Network for agreeing to partner with us on this fantastic journey. I think it's really been brilliant to hear the different sort of conversations about women's entrepreneurship in these different countries. So Dinah, I'm going to hand back to you. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Colette. And I'd like to echo your thanks to the chair, the moderator, the panel. Absolutely fascinating insights that you shared with us and great messaging. And it has been an absolute joy to work with all of you and to collaborate on this policy series. And I hope we can continue to do something in the future.